Yes. My name is Milanov. Originally, I come from a small country in southern Europe called Macedonia. Macedonia was part of former Yugoslavia until the beginning of 1990s, and since then is a small independent country. Um I started studying theology in 1996 at Belgrade Theological Seminary. I graduated from that seminary in 2000. Um, I started working as a pastor in my country for 3 years. And after 3 years, in 2003, I came to Newbold College. I started my master degree there. I completed it in Old Testament studies. And after that, I continued to do my doctoral studies. And before the completion of the studies, 2010, 2011 actually, in January, my wife, my daughter and I, we moved back to Serbia, which is the neighboring country to my country and also part of former Yugoslavia. And I worked there 5 years as a pastor. I also taught at Belgrade Theological Seminary, and I was a guest lecturer at Newbold College. In the meantime, I completed my doctoral studies, and my supervisor, Dr. Lawrence Turner, he got retired in 2015. So they vacated the position. I applied to the position, and they accepted me as a lecturer in Old Testament studies. So that's how I'm again in England. Uh, I teach at undergraduate level, I teach on postgraduate level. My specialty is the book of Daniel, and that's what I also teach at the college as well. I'm married. Soon I'll be 45. We have one daughter, my wife and I. They are in Wokingham SDA Church today, because if they travel with me, they can't remember the churches where they have been. So it's not very healthy, yes, to travel with me all the time. Okay, for this sermon, I prepared a topic that is part of the ABCD of Christianity. Why? After 5 to 4, probably 10, 11 years of studying theology, and after more than 8 years of being a pastor, and after 10 years experience of being a teacher, I have realized that majority of our problems and misgivings as Christians, they stem from the non-understanding or non-applying even more of the ABCD of Christianity. So the most complex problems we encounter, either as a local church or as a denomination in global or in our personal spiritual life, we actually encounter problems that they stem from the ABCD of our Christianity. And that's why this time I'm going to preach about faith. And this time we are going to talk about faith in action. Because if the faith is not in action, Apostle James said that faith is dead. So any faith that it's not in action, it's useless. And it's not a proper faith. It's a pseudo faith. So we are going to pay attention, close attention to this event that is described in the Gospel of Matthew in chapter 15. Before we go to the very content of this paragraph, I would like to remind you what is before this event and what follows this event. Because verse 21 of chapter 15 says that Jesus left that place. Well, if you go back, it's very difficult to find what was exactly that place. We knew that he was in the land of Gennesaret. Probably he was in the lands around the Galilean Sea. But we exactly know what Jesus encountered there and what was the atmosphere Jesus encountered. Basically, at the beginning of chapter 15, we have two groups of very religious people who came even from Jerusalem to Galilee. And that was some time of traveling at that time. And those people came to Jesus and they started a debate. And the debate was why your disciples don't wash their hands up to the elbow. That was the most important theological question they had for Jesus. Obviously, these people, they did not have quite huge regard for Jesus. And actually, they were like an enemies to him, or better said, they experienced Jesus as their enemy. And they tried at every occasion just to provoke him, to test him. And basically, when Jesus left that place, that was the atmosphere of enmity, atmosphere of confrontation, and if you like, the atmosphere of distrust. Atmosphere of distrust. Because if you have an enemy, that's the person or group of individuals you do not trust. So Jesus left that atmosphere. If you go to the beginning of chapter 16, you're going to find the same group of people for whom Matthew, as the gospel writer, is saying us that they came to Jesus to test him. To test him. And this time, it was not a theological debate, but this time they asked him, could you please give us a sign? Do not play games anymore with us. Could you please give us a sign? However, between the events of this lady approaching Jesus in chapter 15, verses 21 to 28, we have Jesus who cured many people along the Sea of Galilee, says verse 29 of chapter 15. And after that, you've got an event when Jesus fed 4,000 people. And suddenly, after these events, Pharisees and Sadducees, they approach Jesus and ask him for a sign. I would call this not just disrespectful, I would call this distrust. And in the midst of these events of distrust, enmity, you've got an event about a Canaanite woman. In comparison to the Pharisees, this Canaanite woman was a loser in the eyes of the Jews. She actually belonged to a people traditionally seen as the enemy of Israel. These Canaanite people were everything the Jews did not want to be. Canaanites were people who were despised by Jews. And Jesus left that place, verse 21 of chapter 15 says, and went away to the district of Tyre and Sidon. Now, if we are, or if we were, some average Jews of those times, we would say, if Jesus could not find any allies among the Pharisees and the Sadducees, why is he going to the region of Tyre and Sidon? In other words, what good can come from Tyre and Sidon? Do you remember any good? Well, it's very difficult. Probably the only positive person in the Old Testament coming from these places was Hiram, the manager or the main builder of the first temple during the time of Solomon. And that's it. Everything else, or everybody else who came from Tyre and Sidon, was very negative. Can you remember one lady? Jezebel, one of the most negative individuals, characters of the Old Testament. She was a princess of one of the rulers from either Tyre or Sidon. If you go to the book of Ezekiel, you'll find that Ezekiel, at one point, he prophesies against Tyre. Why? Because Tyre laughed when Jerusalem suffered at the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. So Tyre and Sidon are places of pagan worship, evil things, and those who mocked Israel when they suffered. So, if Jesus couldn't find any allies among his people, what could he find in these places, Tyre and Sidon? And we are surprised. And basically, this small paragraph from verses 21 to 28 is quite surprising. Almost at every verse, you encounter a surprise. So, the first surprise is that Jesus left for Tyre and Sidon. And just when he was probably entering that area, because Tyre and Sidon, they were cities on the Mediterranean seacoast. However, as very rich cities and politically and militarily strong, they ruled the inland territory probably in deep of 30 miles each. So probably Jesus did not reach the very cities of Tyre and Sidon, but he was just entering that territory of rule. And just then, a Canaanite woman from that region came out and started shouting. Now we are surprised, because at that time, usually, women were not allowed to talk to men into public. Even in the church, sometimes when they had problems, Paul advised, if your wife has something to ask you, let you discuss that at home. So that was the cultural problem at that time. Now, she's coming from that region. She is a woman, she is a Canaanite, and she started shouting. Even in British culture, if you go on the street, sometimes it's very inappropriate to shout at somebody. If you are in Italy, that's not a problem. But if you are somewhere in Europe, in certain places, that could be a problem. And probably that was a great problem during the time of Jesus. She was a Canaanite, she was a woman, and she started shouting at him. So, what's going on here? Now, we are even more surprised when she said, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David." You can't imagine what kind of surprise this would be for Jesus and his disciples, especially for his disciples. And probably if we were some Jews in the 1st century AD reading these words, we would be utterly surprised. Because this is not vocabulary of Canaanites. This should have been the vocabulary of Pharisees, Sadducees, and every single Jew who met Jesus Christ. But this Canaanite woman, she came out of nowhere, and she says to Jesus, actually she shouts to him the words, "O Lord, Son of David." Son of David, during the time of Jesus Christ, it was a very much established title or designation for Messiah. So this lady living in the area of Tyre and Sidon, a Canaanite woman, she immediately recognized Jesus Christ as Messiah. Professional readers of the Bible, the religious elite of Jesus' time, they had problems to recognize who Jesus is because they requested, could you please give us a sign? But this lady, she didn't come to ask for a sign. She came for something else. Already she recognized Jesus as Messiah, and she calls him Lord. So he's not just Messiah for her, but he's also Lord. She recognized that Jesus was more than a human being. Amazing, amazing. And she explains what is the problem. My daughter is tormented by a demon. Demon. The Greek text, it says that this young lady, her daughter, she was suffering badly by the demon. So this Canaanite woman, she didn't come for a theological discussion. She didn't come to seek any sign about Jesus' lordship or messianicship, but she came with a need. Her daughter was ill, badly tormented by a demon. Having a sick child probably is the worst nightmare for any parent. And having a child who suffers badly is the worst nightmare a parent can have. And especially if you see a child when suffers, that's a huge problem. When I was a little boy, my older brother and our first cousin, and they are the same age, they tricked me to go in the cinema with them. And at that time, in the cinema was a projection of probably the worst horror movie ever recorded. That was the horror movie of The Exorcist. Terrible movie. And I was 6 or 7, and at that time in my country they didn't take a note who is coming to the cinema to watch whatever film, so anybody could have come to the cinema. And I remember that actually I didn't watch this movie because I spent all the time with my palms on my eyes. However, I saw certain scenes, and I can tell you that these scenes, they persecuted me for decades after that. When I was a student at Newbold, it was probably 2007, I realized that this movie was on Channel 4 or ITV, and I told my wife I have to face my demons. And I prayed and I told her, you should go to bed, this movie is not for you. And I watched the movie in order to explain myself as a Christian that God is much stronger than these who are portrayed there. But my point is that in the movie, actually a very young girl was tormented by a demon. And those scenes were terrible and horrible. So, if something this Canaanite woman experienced, at least some of this, without dramatic effect, without this Hollywood effect, I can imagine that it was a horror film, not just when you go to the cinema, but it's a horror film in your home. You live that. It's not a movie, it's a reality. So she came to Jesus with an ultimate need. This prayer, "O Lord, have mercy on me," actually was a prayer about life and death. And now, we expect Jesus to say, no problem, will do that. Why? Because Jesus said previously in the Gospel of Matthew that he wasn't able to do many miracles in certain places because of people's disbelief. And he said that if these miracles happened to Sodom and Gomorrah, these miracles that people saw them in Horizon, in Bethsaida, in Capernaum, that Sodom and Gomorrah would have repented a long time ago. And now Jesus is encountered by a Canaanite woman with an ultimate need. Now we are a bit worried because usually a male figure is approaching Jesus and ask him, could you please heal my child? If you go to John 4, you're going to find a father approaching Jesus for healing his child. Jairus, he was a very known man, one of the elders of the synagogue in that place. He approached Jesus, could you please come and heal my daughter? So usually father figures would approach Jesus about healing their children. But in this place, we can highly assume that this lady, a Canaanite woman, she was a widow. Because if she was not a widow, probably her husband would come. So this lady was probably, in the eyes of Jews, on the lowest level in the society. She was a woman, she was a widow, and she was a Canaanite. Probably only people who died were in a worse position than her. And on the top of that, her daughter was suffering badly. During the Jesus time, and in the time of the Old Testament, and even today, some people believe that if you suffer, it means that you are a bad Christian, bad believer. Why? Because they believe in lex talionis, that good things only happen to good people, and bad things happen only to bad people. So this lady, she was in an ultimate need. Probably she couldn't recommend herself to Jesus. I'm somebody in the society. I'm rich. I'm somebody who is meaningful in this society. No. She had nothing to recommend herself to Jesus with. And now we expect that Jesus says, no problem. I will do that. I will heal your daughter. Why? Because whenever you open the Gospels and whenever Jesus is asked to heal somebody, he does that. Even when he was passing by a village of Nain, which was one of the neighboring villages next to Nazareth, he saw a column of people going for a funeral of a young man. And he was not asked anything, but by his initiative, he came, he approached this young man, he touched him, and he resurrected him. So, this is the usual response of Jesus Christ. Whenever they ask him to heal somebody, he did that. However, the text says that after this request, but he did not answer her at all. Jesus ignored her. Can you imagine yourself in the situation of this woman? You have an ultimate need. You have faith. You have knowledge about God's promises. You approach God. You ask Him not about yourself. You're asking something about somebody else. And God is ignoring you. At this point, I would feel probably some butterflies in my stomach. However, the disciples, they were the one who answered something. And his disciples came and urged him, saying, "Send her away, for she keeps shouting after us." But this is not true. She didn't shout after them. She was shouting after Jesus. What a strange group of people, these disciples of Jesus. And finally, Jesus answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." To be honest, I was not expecting this answer. When I read this text 20-something years ago for the first time, I was shocked. What's going on? Jesus, a nationalist? Jesus, discriminator of people? No. I'm surprised. What's going on? Well, the text is not explaining to us why Jesus did that. The text is a narrative. And one of the techniques of the narrator to show you what's going on in the narrative, sometimes the narrator comments upon the characters' words, their emotions, their thoughts. And sometimes the narrator will tell you what's going on in the heart of certain characters. And I would love to know what went through Jesus' mind at this time. But we don't know. He just said, "I was sent to the lost sheep of Israel only." Can you imagine yourself in this situation? You have an ultimate need. You pray to God, and He's telling you, "Sorry, you're not qualified. You were born in a wrong family, in a wrong nation. Sorry, goodbye." I would probably react in this way. "I'm sorry, I didn't choose my family. I didn't choose my gender either. I didn't choose the place where I was born. I didn't choose my nation. I didn't choose what would be my mother tongue. I didn't choose anything out of this. Why should I be responsible for that?" However, this lady, she had something else to say. And she said, she came and knelt before him, saying, "Lord, help me." She is praying, the Lord is ignoring her. And on the top of that, she's telling her, "You're not qualified." However, she decided to ignore the Lord. And she continued to pray, saying, "Lord, help me." This woman, she is not angry. She is not disappointed. But she is adamant. She had a need. And she is adamant that this need should be satisfied. That's what is faith in action. Sometimes we pray and we have a feeling that our prayer is not reaching the ceiling. But this lady, her faith is going beyond what she can see and what she can hear. Her faith is going beyond the real situation. Why was Jesus behaving in this way? One of the main questions of the narrative. Well, there are several theories by some human interpreters. But I agree with the theory of Ellen G. White. She says that with this kind of behavior, Jesus demonstrated how discrimination of people on any level is bad. Why? Because this was an object lesson for his disciples. Jesus' disciples were people of their own time. And they believed that they, as Jews, were something special in comparison to other people. However, we are less judgmental towards our sins than to the sins of other people. Do you agree with that? Let me tell you. Sometimes when we sin, we try to find justification. Well, we are sinful people. Well, momentarily is a weakness. Something like that. But when somebody else does the same thing, oh, it's not the same thing. You are a greater sinner than myself. Your human nature is more sinful than my nature. You do not pray enough. You do not believe enough. So we are ready much more to see the wrong in other people than in ourselves and to be judgmental about that. Even more, Paul says to Timothy, if somebody sins publicly, you have to rebuke these people publicly. Why? So other people who do the same thing in the secrets can say, wow, this is so wrong. So when you see somebody else who does your sin or something that you do as well, you can become very aware that this is quite wrong. So basically Jesus was giving them an object lesson how bad it looks when somebody discriminates other people. However, this Canaanite woman, she didn't know that she was part of the object lesson. My brothers and sisters, we are part of the great controversy. Very often, we don't know what's going on a global level. Why in this situation? Why God behaves in this way? I don't know. This lady didn't know. She didn't come to Jesus to question his answers. She came to him to ask him for healing her daughter. That's the faith in action. And she came to him with respect. He answered, "It is not good or fair to take children's food and throw it to the dogs." Finally, God spoke to her, and it seems that he insulted her even more. Well, the metaphor of dog in the Bible is not very positive. If you go to Revelation 22, where are the dogs? Outside of Jerusalem, of New Jerusalem. Paul, in Philippians 3, he says, be aware of the dogs. And dogs in Philippians 3 are actually false teachers. Well, to be a dog today is not bad. Because there are some dogs who live better than 90% of the human beings on this planet. Do you believe that? They were driven in limousines, they inherit millions, and they're treated like kings and queens. But this was quite insulting to tell a nice, believing lady, you are a dog. However, she did not take this as an offense, and she said, yes, Lord. She never forgets to call Jesus Lord. Yes, Lord. Yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. So she came to him and she said, I don't need much. I need crumbles of your power, of your grace, of your love. I need crumble. and my daughter will be healed. This is like an echo of the Roman captain saying, no, no, no. I'm not worthy that you can come to my home. But just say a word, because I can see that you are a person of authority, as I am. Just say a word, and my servant will be healed. So this is the same faith. And Jesus replies to this, "O woman." This is the true Jesus. Saying "O woman" was the expression of respect, because Jesus used the same word when he addressed his mother from the cross. "O woman, this is your son," for John. So Jesus at the end showed his right face and said, "O woman, great is your faith." This is the second place, only the second place, where Jesus applies the adjective great to somebody's faith. The only other place where Jesus said for somebody's faith that is great, what was the faith of the Roman captain. So my brothers and sisters, this is the true evaluation of somebody's faith. Great is your faith. Because this woman, she didn't argue with God about theology, about his behavior. She just came and asked him, "Heal my daughter." That's it. So faith in action is not just about questioning God, but faith in action is when in prayer you come and ask something that you know that is God's will. That's faith in action. When you ignore God's ignorance, when you ignore the element of time, when you ignore your environment, when you ignore the voices of people around you, but you're just focused on what God promised. We don't know how this woman came to this stage of belief. We don't know that. But what we know is how faith in action functions. It functions with continual prayer. It functions with continual respect of God. It functions in continual request, "Fulfill your will in my life." So my brothers and sisters, faith in action is when you do not look at yourself and saying, "Well, I'm not worthy." No, no, no. You look at God who is worthy. Faith is not a faith who says, "Well, God ignores me, I'm going to ignore him." No, we don't know sometimes why God is silent. Do you know? I don't know. There was a period in my life when I prayed every day, hundreds of times, for something. And God did not reply in 3 months. And probably that was the period of my greatest suffering. And finally God responded. Never ever I found what happened during this time. But what I found that after this time, I never ever doubted God in certain things. So my brothers and sisters, faith is nothing. Our knowledge of the Bible is nothing unless we put all of that into action. So if you are in a situation that you pray and you do not get the answer you expect, do not stop praying. Let me give you an illustration. Winston Churchill, the famous or infamous, depends how you look at him, Prime Minister of Great Britain. Winston Churchill, he lived quite a long life, probably more than 90 years. He was one of the victors of the Second World War. And he was known as a man who wanted to drink. At one point, he drank half a liter, 1 pint of whiskey per day. And he was known as a man with dry humor. One day, one of the female members of the British Parliament approached him and told him, "You should be ashamed. You are drunk." And he replied, "You are ugly, and tomorrow I'll be sober." Winston Churchill also suffers from clinical depression. And he suffered for the most of his adult life. And the problem with clinical depression is that at certain points, this depression can come back and keep to the person for some period. And during this period is a huge suffering. So Churchill suffered from depression, and in order to face this depression in a much easier way, he called it Black Dog. And once he gave an advice for people who suffered of depression. And he said this: if you find yourself going through hell, just keep going. Let me paraphrase. If you find yourself going through a terrible situation, just keep praying. The enemy, he will do everything for you in order to stop praying. He will do everything in order for you to stop respecting and worshiping God. Because the great controversy is about that, worshiping God. So please, faith in action. Keep believing. Keep praying. Do not stop until God responds in the real way. Amen.